What's up, y'all? This is Questlove, and at QLS, I get to hang out with my friends, Sugar Steve, Laia, Fontigolo, Unpaid Bill, and we, at Questlove Supreme, like to nerd out and do deep dives with musicians and actors and politicians and creatives and people that we feel really deserve that attention. We learn, we laugh, we fall down rabbit holes. Listen to Questlove Supreme on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Suprema!
Want to know how to leverage culture to build a successful business? Then Butternomics is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Brandon Butler, founder and CEO of Butter ATL. And on Butternomics, we go deep with today's most influential entrepreneurs, innovators, and business leaders to peel back the layers on how they use culture as the driving force in their business. Butternomics will give you what you need to take your game to the next level. Listen to Butternomics on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Essie Cupp, and I've spent my career interviewing people about politics, presidential elections, and some really tough breaking news. But now I need a break, and I think you do too. So on my new podcast, Off the Cup, I'll still be interviewing people, usually famous and most likely my friends, but about life. The stuff that consumes us when we're not consumed by politics. So come join me every Wednesday for some conversational self-care. Listen to Off the Cup on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows.
There's a lot of talk about mindfulness these days, which is fantastic. I mean, we all want to be more present and self-aware, more patient, less judgmental. We discuss all these themes on the podcast, but it's hard to actually be mindful in your day-to-day life. That's where Calm comes in. I've been working with Calm for a few years now with the goal of making mindfulness fun and easy. Calm has all sorts of content to help you build positive habits, shift your self-talk, reframe your negative thoughts, and generally feel better in your daily life. So many incredible options from the most knowledgeable experts in the world, along with renowned meditation teachers. You can also check out my 7-minute daily series to help you live more mindfully each and every day. Right now, listeners of On Purpose get 40% off a subscription to Calm Premium at calm.com/J. That's calm.com/JAY for 40% off. Calm your mind, change your life. Procrastination can be a form of self-sabotage and a source of self-undoing. For example, it shows up regularly in people who are working one job, but harbor a secret, unfulfilled fantasy of doing something else. Maybe their dream is to become a performer or a writer, or maybe they've always wanted to learn to play the piano or run a full marathon or hike. They spend hours, days, weeks, and years dreaming about this future self and imagining how fulfilling and rich their lives will become once they finally make their move. Someday, they think. But if you're a procrastinator, it never happens. And the excuses they come up with to explain why very likely have nothing to do with the real reason, which in 9 cases out of 10 can be traced back to experiences they had and the patterning that was imprinted in their early childhood.
The #1 health and wellness podcast.
Jay Shetty.
Jay Shetty.
The one, the only Jay Shetty.
Hey everyone, welcome back to On Purpose. I'm so grateful that you're here spending your next few minutes with me, whether you're on a walk, whether you're walking your dog, whether you're cooking, whether you're driving, whether you're cleaning, whatever you're up to. Thanks for tuning in with me right now. And I'm so glad that we're living at a time where mental health has taken center stage, and where more of us than ever before are familiar with the ideas and concepts around mental health. I believe that On Purpose has been a significant part of doing that because of you. You've helped spread On Purpose, spread this message so that so many people feel seen, feel heard, feel understood. And I couldn't thank you enough for all the reviews, for sharing the episodes with friends, the cut downs on TikTok and Instagram. It's amazing. Keep them coming. Today's episode is about the 4 ways we self-sabotage ourselves and the 3 ways we can overcome those instincts and impulses that run counter to our own success and happiness. While we may not be familiar with self-sabotage, most of us know what sabotage means. We've all seen films or television shows where one person sabotages another, whether it's a coworker who steals a colleague's report, or a bridesmaid who sabotages her friend's wedding by drinking too much and causing a scene. Outside of the movies, though, it's surprisingly common at work as well. For example, you and your team may be engaged in a collaborative project, but a colleague decides to withhold important information and his behavior ends up compromising everything you've ever worked for. That's sabotage. But in this episode, we're going to be focusing on the kind of sabotage that's aimed at ourselves. I define acts of self-sabotage as behaviors where we get in our own way. We trip ourselves up. We do or say things or act in ways that run counter to our own stated goals and our own success. Behaviors where we're our worst enemy and not even aware we are either. In fact, self-sabotage can even be framed as acting in a passive-aggressive way around ourselves. Because somewhere inside our own brains, we don't want what we tell ourselves we want. Think about this for a second. There's this beautiful statement by Muhammad Ali. He said, it's not the mountain you're climbing, it's the pebble in your shoe. Right? This idea of what's tripping you up, what's getting caught in your shoe. I'm sure you're thinking about that recently as well. Like, what's blocking you? And sometimes we'll blame someone externally. Sometimes we'll find someone else to take the responsibility. We'll shift accountability. But what is that? It's self-sabotage. And some of you may even have become more familiar with this idea and you're thinking to yourself, Jay, I keep doing this. I keep getting in my own way. But now I feel guilty about it. Now I feel shameful about it. And now I feel bad about it. And that's not the point of this episode. The point of this episode is not to make you feel worse about it. It's to help you deal with it and feel better about it. So what do I mean when I say passive aggressive? When we use that term about other people, it's usually in the context of, say, a friend making a joking remark, except she delivers that remark in a tone of voice that's not especially friendly or well-meaning, right? It's like when your partner's mad at you, but they want to try and pass it off as it's not that serious, but really it is that serious. Like maybe they're angry at you, but they can't admit it, or more like they're not even aware of their own anger. And instead of acknowledging, it sneaks out indirectly or passively in a way that communicates what they're feeling, but it's not honest enough, right? It's like it's coming out in a way where it's like, I hope you know what I mean, but I'm not going to have the courage enough to say it. Or let's imagine that you and your partner just ended a night out with a big argument. Most couples take a certain amount of time to cool off before sitting down and doing the repair work necessary to ensure their relationship is back on good footing. But if your partner is passive aggressive, he or she will go out of their way to avoid resolving the argument. They might give you the silent treatment or stomp around the house and make a lot of noise to communicate that they're angry or their feelings have been hurt. What they won't do is tell you, which means you have to read in between the lines and be the grown-up. You now all of a sudden have to become a mind reader. You have to be that person who understands what's not being said, and you kind of feel a bit of pressure for it. What's really interesting is that self-sabotage acts in a similar way, but with an important difference. When a friend acts in a passive-aggressive manner, they're refusing or unable to acknowledge their feelings. And as I said, sometimes they have no idea what those feelings are in the first place. This is why I often frame acts of self-sabotage as passive-aggressive behavior that we show not to another person, but to ourselves. Buried deep in our brain are feelings that for whatever reason, we don't want to let out into the open. Feelings that usually go back to our childhoods, our relationship with our parents or our siblings, and the attachments we developed or weren't able to develop with family members and friends. Years afterwards, we're still reenacting these models and dynamics in our behavior at work and with our friends and in our relationships. The problem being that most of the time, we're the last people to know about it. Another way to define self-sabotage is behavior that runs counter to or even contradicts what we tell ourselves we want. Let me give you an example. On the morning you're scheduled to deliver an important presentation at work, you don't hear your alarm clock ring and you oversleep. Instead of getting up early and rehearsing your presentation, as you've been planning to do all week, you roll out of bed in a panic, take a crazed 2-minute shower, and show up at work an hour late. By now, what's left of our nervous system is in tatters. When the time comes for you to deliver the presentation, you don't do as good as a job as you hoped. Your voice is unsteady, the slides in your deck are out of order, and you leave the room convinced you're going to be fired. Now, we all have days that don't go the way we want them to, but it's not irrelevant to the topic of self-sabotage to wonder, what's really going on with you? The answer could be any number of things. Maybe you hate your job or your boss and have been thinking about quitting for weeks, except you fear what your parents might say. So in this case, by showing up late and being unprepared, you've set up your boss to be disappointed in you and possibly lay you off. In essence, what is going on is that since you can't acknowledge your own ambivalence at work, you end up blowing up your own career. Can you relate to that? Like maybe not exactly like that, but I hope that resonates. Here's another example. Imagine you're in a relationship that from every category you can check off is ideal. The two of you get along fantastically well, you have the same taste in food and music and film and TV shows, your families get along, they have things in common, and you feel you could spend the rest of your life with this person. At least that's what you tell yourself. So why, even though you feel you found the person you want to spend the rest of your life with, have you begun acting so cold and withdrawn to the point where your partner becomes so frustrated they decide to break things off with you? Maybe, just maybe, the truth of the matter is that you fear intimacy and you don't know it. Maybe you were burned before or multiple times before, and your detachment and indifference is nothing more than a defense mechanism. Maybe without being aware of if you learned from your parents' relationship or somewhere else that people close to you can't be trusted. So out comes an act of self-sabotage, in this case, emotional withdrawal. And from that point on, you tell yourself that you're terrible at relationships and how it's never your fault, but always the fault of the other person. That's self-sabotage. You're probably wondering what's going on in the brain that leads to self-sabotage. Well, remember that the brain has one mission, which is to keep us alive and in balance. In that guise, it's focused on steering us away from threats while simultaneously motivating us with the promise of future rewards. Self-sabotage typically comes about when these two desires get confused and blurry. Think of it as an ongoing war between dopamine and other brain regions that include the hypothalamus, amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. To use our early example, let's imagine that on the surface at least, you tell yourself you want to excel at work. There's no reason not to believe you either. You're eager to show your boss and your colleagues what you can do. And in response, your brain floods your system with dopamine. But other areas of your brain have something to say too. Hearing you want to excel at work stresses your brain out, puts it on edge, makes it fearful. The hypothalamus kicks off this stress response by sending a message to the pituitary gland, which in turn stimulates the adrenal glands, which release cortisol, the stress hormone. Your breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure all shoot up. More and more blood sugar is pumped into your bloodstream to give you energy for what's ahead. Basically, what's happening is that the reward and threat centers of your brain are at war with each other. They're being given contradictory messages, but the problem is, you can't admit it. Remember that the brain is always acting in our own best interest. Its mission at the end of every day is to protect us. The reward-seeking part of your brain may be saying, I want to succeed at work. But the regions of the brain that predict potential threats respond by saying, do I really? Then why do I feel so angry? Why am I holding back? In its chemical way, our brains are like friends through thick and thin who know us better than we know ourselves. Here's another example. You might be someone who has always wanted to follow their passion, but keep putting it off. This is because your brain is busy predicting how you would feel if you pursued that dream but came up short. In other words, your brain is trying to protect you from emotions it knows are painful for you to feel. Future embarrassment, future disappointment, future pain. This is the essence of self-sabotage. The brain knowing things we don't, or that we don't want to admit to ourselves, which in turn obliges us to act cross purposes with ourselves. Self-sabotage isn't a cause or a source of anything. It's a symptom of a feeling or a dynamic that we're usually not aware of. When we act in a self-sabotaging way, we almost never do it consciously. Otherwise, we would probably stop ourselves. Unless we've been seeing a therapist for a long time, rarely do we have access to the original feeling or model that leads us to act in ways that run counter to our own interests and ambitions. Self-sabotage has many faces, but here are the top 4 ways we do it. So you can use this as a checklist to understand. The first way is chronic lateness. Here I'm not talking about those times when we're stuck in traffic or when we realize the clock in our car doesn't match the time on our phones and we arrive 20 minutes later for a doctor's appointment or a meeting with a friend. I'm talking about the habit of lateness. Lateness that happens so often and predictably that it's your middle name. The trait most closely associated with you. If someone tells you that lunch starts at 1 o'clock sharp, you don't show up till 1:15, 1:30, or even later. You always have a good reason too. Your car was low on gas. You couldn't find your keys. The dog needed to be let out. A phone call came in that you had to take. Whatever the reason, it's always something. Now, most of us who are late apologize for holding everyone else up. And after that, things are fine. It's no big deal. You might even be someone with a genuinely flaky relationship with time and scheduling. Someone who has trouble predicting how long it takes to get somewhere or get something done. But consider what your chronic lateness communicates to your friends and work colleagues. It reduces the trust they have in you. It means you can't be trusted to keep your word or be relied upon. Those are the real-world effects your chronic lateness has on other people. But considering that this episode is about self-sabotage, what are some of the underlying reasons that drive the behavior of someone who's never on time? You could be someone who secretly believes the rules that apply to other people don't apply to you. Maybe you're on the outs with your friends, but don't have the heart, the time, or the patience to find another friend group. Maybe you're secretly a diva who knows that by always showing up late, you can make a grand entrance with everyone's eyes on you and everyone whispering about that you're finally here. Whatever the unconscious motive is, it ends up doing you far more damage than good.
Hi, I'm Essie Cupp, and I've spent the last 20 plus years knee-deep in politics and the news. I've covered some really tough subjects, from war to genocide to 6 presidential elections, way too much Trump. And you know what? I need a break, like a mental health break from the news, from the triggering headlines. And I kind of suspect some of you listening out there might need a break too. So my new podcast is going to be just that, a fun and loose space where I talk to my famous friends and people I admire about all the stuff that consumes us when we're not consumed by politics.
I did not really rebel in the 60s. I had no sex in the 70s.
What?
I made no money in the 80s. So when true crime came along, I missed that trend too.
So many great guests are joining me, from Josh Mankiewicz to Larry Wilmore to Molly Jong-Fast to Josh Gad.
I'm so excited that you have this platform, and I am just like hoping that I don't destroy the platform in its earliest stages.
Listen to Off the Cup on the iHeart Radio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows.
What's up, y'all? This is Questlove, and at QLS I get to hang out with my friends, Sugar Steve, Laia, Fontigolo, Unpaid Bill, and we, at Questlove Supreme like to nerd out and do deep dives with musicians and actors and politicians and journalists.
We give you the stories behind all your favorite artists and creatives that you have never heard. I'm talking about stories behind their life journeys and their works of art.
I love QLS because of the QLS Team Supreme. They're like a second family to me.
If you're a fan of deep diving into music, everything, almanacking your musical history, and learning things about hip-hop artists and things you never thought, then you're a lot like me. But you're also a fan of Questlove Supreme.
One of the things I love the most about this show is that we get to learn from the masters. I look at being on this show as my graduate program in music.
Listen to Questlove Supreme on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Suprema!
Hey, I'm Jack Beast Thomas, the host of a brand new Black Effect original series, Black Lit, the podcast for diving deep into the rich world of Black literature. I'm Jack Beast Thomas, and I'm inviting you to join me and a vibrant community of literary enthusiasts dedicated to protecting and celebrating our stories. Black Lit is for the page turners, for those who listen to audiobooks while commuting or running errands, for those who find themselves seeking solace, wisdom, and refuge between the chapters. From thought-provoking novels to powerful poetry, we'll explore the stories that shape our culture. Together, we'll dissect classics and contemporary works while uncovering the stories of the brilliant writers behind them. Blacklit is here to amplify the voices of Black writers and to bring their words to life. Listen to Blacklit on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
A second way we self-sabotage ourselves is procrastination. Procrastination, of course, means putting things off until the very last minute, or in some cases, never getting around to them at all. Like all the examples of self-sabotage in this episode, we've all been guilty at least once in our life. The problem, as always, is when we take these acts or behaviors to extremes. For example, I'm sure we've all had the experience in high school or college when we put off writing a paper. We were given a week to complete it, and every day we told ourselves we would at least get started. But as the week went on, we never did. At least not until the day before it was due, when we stayed up all night writing it and earned a not very good grade from the teacher or the professor. Or maybe you were one of those people who always did well anyway. But when it becomes a habit or a routine, procrastination can be a form of self-sabotage and a source of self-undoing. For example, you might be someone who delays paying bills you know are due the first of every month, but which you don't get around to addressing in time, which gets you into trouble with creditors and collection agencies. But where I see procrastination most often is in our own ambitions. It shows up regularly in people who are working one job, but harbor a secret, unfulfilled fantasy of doing something else. Maybe their dream is to become a performer or a writer, or maybe they've always wanted to learn to play the piano or run a full marathon or hike. They spend hours, days, weeks, and years dreaming about this future self and imagining how fulfilling and rich their lives will become once they finally make their move. Someday, they think. But if you're a procrastinator, it never happens, for any number of reasons. And the excuses they come up with to explain why very likely have nothing to do with the real reason, which in 9 cases out of 10 can be traced back to experiences they had and the patterning that was imprinted in their early childhood. The fear of failure, for example, or its close cousin, the fear of success. What would it really mean to pursue and accomplish their dreams or their goals? It might mean doing better than your parents in a way that's shameful to acknowledge. Or maybe your mom or dad had their own dreams they weren't able to pursue. By procrastinating and putting off what you want, you're protecting your parents and maintaining a familiar dynamic within your own family. It's an act of love that ends up damaging you. I don't have enough time, you think, or I'm too old, or I have responsibilities to your partner and my family. All of these things may be true, but it's not the real reason why you're procrastinating. By now, I hope you've become more aware of the conflict that arises in the brain when we self-sabotage, and of the misalignment that happens when our conscious behavior is at odds with our own unconscious motives. All acts of self-sabotage, remember, can be seen as defense mechanisms. They're the brain's way of protecting us from the stress and fear of confronting more difficult emotions. The third way we self-sabotage ourselves is by putting ourselves down. It's pretty easy to make fun of people who take themselves too seriously. There's even an argument to be made that the TV show The Office gave rise to a new brand of humor that comes from knowing more about other people than they know about themselves. And make no mistake, self-deprecating humor is a very attractive and humanizing quality to have. It not only shows you have a sense of humor about yourself and your position in the world, it communicates that despite the good things that are happening in your life, you're still the person you always were. But here I'm referring to the constant habit of denigrating yourself, whether by apologizing too much, showing excessive humility, or never stopping to acknowledge the times you have a win in your column. Putting yourself down shows up in ways both obvious and not so obvious. Studies show that girls and women apologize more than men do, and many girls say "I'm sorry" almost as a reflex. But as well as showing kindness and consideration, the habit of over-apologizing can risk coming across to others as insecure and self-doubting, while at the same time undermining your own self-esteem. Denigrating yourself is also very common in people who don't know how to receive compliments. I have a friend who is doing fantastically well in his career, but whenever I would point this out, he would always say something like, I was just lucky, or I was in the right place at the right time. But refusing to take credit for your own accomplishments can end up hurting you. In my friend's case, by refusing to acknowledge and appreciate his own success, he was effectively asking others to buttress and validate his accomplishments. He came across as insecure and unconfident, qualities I knew wouldn't serve him well in the future. As is true in all instances of self-sabotage, the origins of our behavior vary, though it's safe to say they began when we were children. If you're constantly denigrating yourself, maybe you grew up around a hypercritical parent, and putting yourself down is a way of keeping that parent's voice close. Maybe, and this is a theme that keeps coming up with self-sabotage, it stems from lower than usual self-esteem, where a long time ago someone gave us the impression that we weren't good enough, or smart enough, or deserving enough. If you're in the habit of putting yourself down, you might fear that the act of owning your success risks alienating friends who aren't at the same level as you. Or possibly you think that unless you put yourself down, someone else will jump in and do it for you. Studies show that while self-deprecation is linked to improve overall psychological health in most people, as usual, the risk comes from overdoing it and being seen as someone who lacks confidence and proficiency in their work. So the next time you hear yourself saying, I was just lucky, or anyone could have done what I did, ask yourself, are my words serving me? Followed by, or are my words protecting me? The fourth and final step of the ways we self-sabotage ourselves is perfectionism. Perfectionism is a personality trait marked by sky-high standards and expectations for yourself and everyone around you. If you're a perfectionist, you're no doubt averse to making mistakes. And this is often accompanied by fear that unless you act or dress or speak or engage or produce in any way other than what you deem to be perfect, then you're opening up yourself to criticism, unhappiness, and feelings of failure. Perfectionism is another common way we self-sabotage ourselves and psych ourselves out of attaining our potential. Perfectionism blocks progress. Perfectionism blocks the process. Perfectionism can block you from unlocking your potential. Perfectionism has its healthy, beneficial sides. It can be incredibly motivating, for one thing, and help you overcome challenges and accomplish what you're after. But what can make perfectionism unhealthy and even toxic is its capacity to paralyze us and keep us from going forward, since our greatest fear is what might happen if we make a mistake or a bad decision. Of course, self-sabotaging perfectionists can't admit this, and instead believe they have higher standards than other people and a vision no one else shares. If you're a perfectionist, chances are good you revise and rework things constantly until you decide they match your impossible standards of perfection, only to discover the next day that the work you considered perfect 24 hours earlier suddenly feels imperfect and in need of more work, which means you have to start all over again. Perfect and perfection are like the proverbial goalposts that refuse to stay put and that keep inching back